When I was young and first introduced to the character of Conan through the movie Conan the Barbarian, which became a cult classic, starred Arnold Schwarzenegger, I was really startled to learn that most of the stories that went into making that movie were not in fact written by Robert E. Howard at all, but were written by other people after him. And to a certain degree that makes sense. Robert E. Howard was very much interested in Conan as an episodic character. In this story, for instance, he's in sort of the region of his forgotten age that corresponds to India and the Middle East. But in other stories, he's a pirate in the Mediterranean, he's in Africa, he's in Europe, and Conan just sort of wanders in and out of different areas of the world doing what Conan wants to do. And he wasn't really interested in making him a very deep, a very sophisticated character. In fact, he's by nature, and Howard's vision of him, simple. In part, this is sort of the theme of the story. If we look at this one, it begins with a lot of complexity. There's a court intrigue. The king has been killed by black magic. There's conspirators afoot and counter-conspirators. And then Conan is introduced 15 pages in by chance, and his immediate actions simplify the story. All these other people with these very cerebral pursuits, these very cerebral advantages, can't stand up to his brawn and to his cunning. And he goes in and saves the day, not in a Tolkien-esque sort of save-the-world fashion, but motivated by his own self-interest and his own personal sense of honor. Now, in this regard, Conan can be read both as sort of a wish fulfillment. Howard himself wasn't very successful, especially not with the ladies, and Conan is both these things. But we can also read into him sort of the classic American rugged individualist hero of the late 19th and early 20th century, which Howard was very strongly influenced by. He's the gunfighter riding out into the sunset at the end of the story. But we can also read into this other things, and I'll get to that in a moment. You already know from the lecture that Howard is not considered the most feminist-friendly author. And D.V. is a really good example, probably his best developed female character. But the problem is that for all of her advantages, all of her abilities, her primary strength in this story is what might be called sexual currency, which she uses to trades and motivates various characters. In this particular story, she serves as a foil for the Conan character. Her inability to accomplish things is contrasted with Conan's ability to accomplish things. So that's something that you should probably take a look at if you miss the first time. Now, as to the second reading today, which offers a very different psychological interpretation of the Conan story and of Robert E. Howard, a little background might be helpful. The character of Gilgamesh is a semi-historical, semi-mythological character. The Epic of Gilgamesh is a Sumerian piece of literature, probably the oldest in the world. And Gilgamesh in this story, this epic, is a king of Uruk who has many adventures, sort of Herculean in stature. And he's primarily concerned with never dying. So in a lot of these stories, he's going around trying to find a way not to die. In the 1980s, an author named Robert Silverberg came along and rewrote the Epic of Gilgamesh into a novel called Gilgamesh the King. And Gilgamesh the King, even though he sort of takes from this Epic of Gilgamesh, which is this ancient text, Gilgamesh the King is much closer to Robert E. Howard's version of Conan. He's a big, brawny, cunning character who's constantly facing off against all these, like, sort of smarter, in a traditional sense, people, but triumphing over them with his just sheer willpower and sheer physical brawn. Later, Silverberg was asked to contribute to something called the ENGL series, which was this various sci-fi and fantasy authors were asked to imagine a vision of the afterlife, much closer to the sort of Greek Hades than the traditional Christian hell, and where basically everyone went after they died. So all these different historical characters end up in hell. And in the Silverberg story, Gilgamesh in the Outback, Gilgamesh has ended up in hell and is kind of taking a shine to it. It's his kind of place, so he wanders around doing semi-heroic things all the time. But he runs into Robert E. Howard and H.P. Lovecraft, who, upon reaching hell, have been charged with becoming sort of diplomatic envoys. Now, this is kind of a literary joke. The idea that the author, Robert E. Howard, who Silverberg owed so much to in his creation of Gilgamesh, that these two people would meet each other in hell. But what Silverberg is sort of asserting is another psychological interpretation of Robert E. Howard and Conan, which is that if one looks at Robert E. Howard's life, one can find some evidence to say that he might have been a homosexual, and that Conan is sort of his idealized man's man. And when Howard meets Gilgamesh and mistakes him for Conan, his reaction is not one of shock, not, here's this fictional character that I created and he's real, but rather his reaction is that he's meeting this person for the first time, and he's filled with awe and admiration. Now, both of these stories are very good at establishing the sort of swords and sorcery tradition that we talked about in the lecture this week. Next week we'll move on to children's fantasy, and we'll see yet another tradition which contributes to the larger model of fantasy literature.